Thousands of Chinese troops are serving as United Nations peacekeepers. How big a role does China play in international peacekeeping operations? Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. More than 30,000 Chinese peacekeepers have served as part of United Nations forces since China began participating in UN peacekeeping missions in 1990. China is now the largest contributor of UN peacekeepers among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and China also plays a major role in funding UN peacekeeping operations. Among our guests is the Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping with the UN, but we begin with Wang Guan. He is our Chief Political Correspondent with CCTV's Mandarin service, and he joins us from the newsroom. Wang Guan, good to see you. What can you tell us about the current level of China's involvement in UN peacekeeping? Where are they deployed, and what type of missions are they engaged in? Because we've seen a lot of involvement since 1990, haven't we?
Right, Nathan. According to the United Nations, at least 2,600 Chinese troops are currently serving in the UN peacekeeping missions. The vast majority of them are based in the West and East African countries. Those in South Sudan and Liberia make up half of China's peacekeepers. 400 Chinese troops are stationed along Israel-Lebanon border in the Middle East, and 400 more are scattered in 9 hotspot regions across the globe. Let's put the numbers in perspective, Nathan. In 2003, China contributed 260 UN peacekeepers. Now, 10 times that many. They're mainly doing 3 things: peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. These are, of course, 3 different things. For peacemaking, they go to active combat zones such as South Sudan to stop the government and rebel groups from fighting each other. For peacekeeping, they remain in conflict zones when active combats are over to preserve a ceasefire. Peace building is the challenging part. These Chinese troops, along with troops from other countries, work with national and local law enforcement agencies to build law and order institutions. There are Chinese engineers to help build infrastructures in Mali, medical teams to fight Ebola in Liberia, and mine-sweeping teams in Lebanon.
Wang Guan, also China back at UNHQ is making major contributions to the funding of UN peacekeeping. The UN obviously welcomed China's support for future peacekeeping efforts. What can you tell us about that?
Well, China currently contributes to 10% of the UN peacekeeping budget. That makes Beijing the 2nd largest donor behind the United States. Chinese President Xi Jinping pledged to train 8,000 additional troops to act as reserve, so whenever and wherever needed, those peacekeepers of China can be dispatched. So when China announced a 300,000 troops cut last year to make its domestic forces more nimble, they're actually increasing their share of their international peacekeeping troops to the United Nations.
Obviously, peacekeeping comes with risks, and China has lost peacekeepers this year. What sort of sacrifices has China suffered during its peacekeeping operations?
Well, according to the Chinese military, at least 13 Chinese soldiers have been killed during UN peacekeeping missions in the past 2 decades. Notably, 2 of them were killed in July this year during fighting between rebels and government troops in South Sudan. The UN recognizes China's sacrifice. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said this July that he thinks China has played a leading role in UN peacekeeping, international development, and combating epidemic diseases. China may not be as big as international development as some powerhouses such as the US, not yet, but it is certainly going in that direction.
Wang Guan from our newsroom, thanks so much. Joining me now from the United Nations headquarters in New York is El-Ghassim Wan. He is Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations with the United Nations. Welcome to the show, sir. First of all, I'd like to ask you from the UN's perspective, what has been the increased contributions of China in terms of men, material, and, of course, money meant for the international organization?
Oh, thank you. Happy to join you. China is an important contributor to the United Nations peacekeeping. China ranked number 12 out of over 120 peacekeeping contributing countries, troop contributing countries, and police contributing countries. We have over 2,600 Chinese uniformed personnel in our peacekeeping missions, in 10 out of 16 peacekeeping missions in Africa, of course, with UNAMID in Darfur, UNMISS in South Sudan, UNMIL in Liberia, MINURSO in Western Sahara, MONUSCO in the DRC. We also have Chinese peacekeepers in Europe, in FICIP, in limited number, and in the Middle East, in UNIFIL in particular, and in UNSTO. And they do, of course, make a huge contribution to our operations, performing in a very satisfactory manner, efficiently and effectively, and that has been shown in a number of theaters. But China also does contribute a number of assets that are critical to the success of peacekeeping, medical doctors, of course, in terms of medical support, engineering, and transportation. And I would like to add that Chinese contribution also includes support to the training of foreign peacekeepers, 2,000. They have committed themselves to training over 2,000 peacekeepers. That includes contribution to the African Union standby force with a contribution of $100 million. And I also would like to add that China has pledged foreign police unit as part of the follow-up to the Leaders Summit on Peacekeeping, as well as the establishment of a standby peacekeeping force of 8,000 strong personnel. So it's a huge, important contribution to United Nations peacekeeping, which is very much appreciated.
It's been a bit of an evolution, hasn't it? When China first got involved in peacekeeping in the 1990s, generally would deploy observers. We saw in Liberia a lot of engineering crews helping rebuild bridges, schools and the like. But then if you fast forward to today, South Sudan deploying their first combat infantry unit, 700 personnel. So what's the evolution been like in terms of the UN, and how has it helped with all these missions?
Well, indeed, it has been an evolution and an increasing contribution by China, as shown not only by actual contribution on the ground in the peacekeeping missions I listed, but also by pledges within the framework of our peacekeeping capability readiness system. And you did make reference to South Sudan, where indeed China has deployed its combat unit for the first time ever. And they performed extremely well and are contributing, of course, to our efforts aimed at creating the space required for a lasting resolution to the conflict in South Sudan. And as you know, unfortunately, Chinese peacekeepers were among those who were injured, and 2 of them were killed in the course of the fighting that took place in Juba, South Sudan, in first part of July. Chinese peacekeepers, unfortunately, were also killed in Mali, and I would like to reiterate our condolences to the Chinese people and government. But those sacrifices are a clear testament to the Chinese commitment to the United Nations peacekeeping, which, as you know, is a multilateral endeavor that can only succeed if you get the support of member states, and China has been one of our strongest supporters.
And as a member of the P5, it also sets an example, obviously.
Absolutely.
I want to just talk to you about the evolution of peacekeeping itself. Peacekeeping, of course, has gone through lots of different phases. There have been lots of soul-searching when missions don't go right, as in the former Yugoslavia, and the reluctance to get involved in Rwanda. But it's also difficult to get troops on the ground during crises when they break out so quickly. So as you are evolving the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, it's very important to have these rapid reaction standby forces. As you mentioned, China has 8,000, is going to be deploying that. How does that fit in with this new view of a more quickly deployable force that can do a lot more with perhaps a lot less manpower?
Well, I think you rightly pointed out the evolution of peacekeeping. And let me just maybe, before responding directly to your question, start by highlighting how relevant peacekeeping is today as a multilateral collective tool to address peace and security challenges across the globe. As you know, we do have 16 peacekeeping operations, over 120,000 peacekeepers, military, police, and civilian personnel who are deployed in a number of member states, and they operate, of course, in increasingly challenging environment where we face asymmetric threat. We have seen it in Mali. They operate in contexts in which member states' consent is at times quite difficult to secure in practical terms, in terms of cooperation with our peacekeepers for them to perform their mandate. And they operate also with resources that are not always adequate, and we can see it in a number of peacekeeping operations where unfortunately we lack critical assets. And over the past few years we have been making tremendous efforts to improve, to enhance the effectiveness of our peacekeeping operations, and the Leaders Summit and the peacekeeping readiness system to which you refer to is part of the process. And China made a pledge of 8,000 uniformed personnel, military personnel, to contribute to that system, and efforts are underway to assess the readiness of those units and to get them at the appropriate level. And of course, the existence of such type of arrangement make it much more easier for us to deploy quickly whenever needed.
Agasim Wan, thank you so much for joining us from United Nations headquarters. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we joined by an international panel as we take a closer look at China's contribution to UN peacekeeping efforts. Please stay with us here on The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anand Naidu, and we're talking about China's increasing role in UN peacekeeping efforts. Joining me now from Beijing is Dr. Yu Qihua. She is an associate professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University, and she's written extensively on China and UN peacekeeping operations. Also joining us from Nairobi is Siddharth Chatterjee. He is one of the United Nations resident coordinator and UN Development Programme representative to Kenya. And join us again here in the studio is Wang Guan. He's our chief political correspondent for China's Mandarin service. Welcome to the show, all of you. Let's start with you, Dr. Liu in Beijing. Can you please tell us why is China now making such a significant contribution to UN peacekeeping, and also the funding as well, the paying for it all?
I think we can understand these questions from three levels. Firstly, with the rising China's economy, Chinese government now attaches greater importance for our image being a responsible great power. So which means that in recent years, we have been thinking about the approaches that we can translate our economic success to the softer power. Put it in another way, how could we attract the people in the world with a commonly accepted value and belief, probably. And that's the first point. Secondly, I think as a belief that China is becoming to be an increasingly important player on the world arena, China still should figure out a way to engage more properly with the international organizations. And as we all know, the United Nations is the most authoritative and universal organization in the world, together with peacekeeping operations and having the great reputation to safeguard the international peace and security. So I think it would be natural for our government to put peacekeeping in the priority of our agenda setting. Thirdly, though China before probably was a bit reluctant, sometimes conservative about talking about national interests. Now it seems like that we are gradually embrace the concept of protecting and sometimes probably enlarge our national interests. More specifically speaking, participating peacekeeping operations would provide China, I think, the best platform to engage more with our partners and also practice our PLA with the NATO military system in a more practical way. And also at the same time, I think it could protect our national interest, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. Siddharth Chatterjee in Nairobi, obviously most UN peacekeeping missions are on the African continent. We're seeing a lot more Chinese peacekeepers. How have you seen Chinese peacekeeping evolve? There seems to be an evolution from the peace building that Wang Guan was talking about earlier, building bridges, engineers, to a much more sort of robust role. And I'm, of course, thinking about South Sudan here.
Nathan, thank you for that question. I think China has demonstrated an agility, a professionalism, and an ability to actually wage a peace. Starting in the early 1990s, when it was small deployments of military observers to about 31,000 peacekeepers and close to 14 UN peacekeeping missions, I think China has become a redoubtable army in terms of providing those services. And these services span engineering, demining, logistics, keeping the peace, medical, training, keeping the sea lane safe, preventing piracy off the coast of Somalia. I think whether it's the Democratic Republic of Congo or South Sudan or off the coast of Somalia, I think on all counts, their services have been meritorious. And I think one of the largest contributors from the permanent five of the Security Council, both in terms of number of troops as well as financial contributions, I think China can play an even bigger role in advancing the peace, because ultimately that is the aim of the entire United Nations Charter, is to build bridges of peace, and I think China is well positioned to do that.
Wang Guan here in the studio. I used to cover the UN for about 10 years, and I used to know how difficult it was to get UN peacekeeping missions up and running. The Secretary General and the head of peacekeeping used to have to beg for equipment and soldiers. And as some nations back off peacekeeping and its risks, we've seen China step up. Why do you think that is? What is happening in the national moment for China that makes this so important?
Right, Nathan. 10 years ago, China's contribution of troops to the United Nations peacekeeping missions was only 1/10 of that today. The pace really started picking up during the end of the former President Hu Jintao's presidency. As China increases its presence in Africa and its engagement in the Middle East, China started sending more troops to the United Nations. But later, it's really things accelerated when President Xi Jinping took office in 2013. And during a milestone foreign affairs work group meeting in 2013, he signaled an end to, or a break to China's Tao Guang Yang Hui foreign policy, which means lay low and bide your time. And he proposed a 奋发有为 foreign policy that is proactively engage the world community and get things done. Under that doctrine, if you will, China really started contributing more troops. In fact, I had the pleasure of going on a patrolling mission with the Chinese Navy back in 2011.
Yes, I remember. Very good stories,
in southern Pacific, when they just finished the patrolling mission off the Gulf of Aden, off the coast of Somalia. Those were tough times. 19, 20-year-old boys being in the ocean for 3 months, not eating well, deprivation of sleep. They're doing what they've got to do. And, that's why people say once a Navy, always a Navy.
I saw some of those Gulf of Aden people in Rimpak as well. Very interesting stories. Can I go to you, Dr. Liu, again? President Xi Jinping last year at the United Nations General Assembly gave a lot of commitments for peacekeeping, including this contribution of 8,000 peacekeepers ready to go at a moment's notice. This is all part of the evolution of UN peacekeeping, isn't it? It's been very difficult to deploy missions. How is China part of this change in peacekeeping, if you like?
If we have to evaluate, China's role in just orienting the change, I think, China could contribute from several levels. Firstly, I think because, as we all know that after Xi's address in the United Nations, China will both increase the personnel dispatch as well as the financial assistance, or just add the budget of the UN peacekeeping operations. And also, I think more importantly, I think China should try to integrate some kind of Chinese characteristics into those kind of UN peacekeeping framework. For example, I think it would be valuable that China could share its experiences, and we have learned from developing our own economy, because our senior officials have been repeatedly emphasized that we need to address the rooting cause for the instabilities happened in those conflict affected countries. So, and also China has been insisting on providing some financial assistance, economic aid for those underdeveloped countries. At the same time, probably provide some assistance for the infrastructure construction, as well as some other kind of medical support, education support, all of which, could be, I think, a whole package, or kind of a, like a future direction for UN peacekeepings. Before it's traditional peacekeeping, robust peacekeeping. Probably in the future, we can integrate peacekeeping a bit with the economic development. So that's peace and development emphasized a lot of times by our government.
Thank you. Sir Chatterjee in Nairobi, it's fair to say that UN peacekeeping has had a few scandals. And the image of UN peacekeeping has been tarnished in the African continent and beyond. Although when I've been reading about Chinese peacekeepers, one incident comes to light in July 10th, when there was a pitched battle between rebel and government forces in South Sudan. There seemed to be a height of professionalism there that allowed many more civilians to make it to safety to the UNMISS camp, even though some, of course, were abused by both sides. Is that what you've seen on the ground?
Well, all I can say is that the Chinese peacekeepers, like many other countries, have demonstrated admirable discipline in the face of adversity. I mean, 21 Chinese peacekeepers have laid down their lives in different peacekeeping missions. However, yes, there is no doubt that we've had episodes where certain soldiers from different peacekeeping nations have maligned the image of the United Nations peacekeeping. I think China has come through over here and stands tall in terms of the discipline, in terms of the value systems it's projected, and in terms of the work it's done. So on that count, I would say that's the model of peacekeeping that we need to go on. But I'll just go back for a moment on what the professor in Beijing said, and I think I completely agree with that. I think peacekeeping needs to be integrated with a form of socio-economic development as well. And this is where a partnership should be forged around the peacekeepers, the civil society organizations, etc. Because ultimately you may have the peace. For example, South Sudan is a good example of that, there was a peace agreement, all that happened, and 2013, everything went belly up. I think the process of permeating the peace at the grassroots between the tribes, looking at issues of reconciliation, did not adequately get addressed. And I think the mandate of peacekeeping now needs to become much more multifaceted, from economic development to reconciliation to keeping the peace to advancing human development, because ultimately a lot of these conflicts, you would agree, are really based on a competition for resources. It's about water, it's about pastures, and then, politics and everything comes into play. But so, I would just conclude by saying that the primacy of politics is crucial in this.
Yeah, so basically combining the peacekeeping and peace-building operations much more tightly in an integrated plan. That's very interesting. There is a lot of talk about a more rapid deployment, a lot more focus on peacemaking, as you know. Wang Guan, how much of a sense is UN peacekeeping and China's contribution a sense of national pride at the moment? I mean, I remember when several have been killed in the last year or so, and there was a deep sense of honor, of the commitment there.
Right. My colleagues in Beijing and in Nairobi perfectly put it, in that it requires discipline, it requires sacrifice, and Chinese troops, just like troops in many other countries, did just that. And it's not just the moments of sadness that became the hallmark of Chinese peacekeeping missions, but also times of joy when the Chinese troops evacuated tens of thousands of Chinese nationals as well as nationals from dozens of different countries in Yemen.
That's right.
Barely last year. And also when the Chinese troops patrolled the Gulf of Aden and engaged with the Somalian pirates and protected the sea lanes and make sure trade, sea lanes for trade were open. Those were the moments of fulfillment and joy. People talk about it back home. Certainly, it is a matter of national pride, but it is also a matter of fulfilling China's commitment as a major stakeholder globally.
Dr. Liu, last word from you. As you are an expert on peacekeeping. What do you think is the proudest moment for China when it comes to peacekeeping operations around the world?
The proud of China. I think firstly, I would like to say, peacekeeping operations for China in the past several decades to a great extent highlighted our national image, on the world stage, safeguarding international peace and security. Just now our experts mentioned some misconducts in the peacekeeping operations. For example, the corruptions and also sexual exploitation and abuse, those kind of deeds. But for China, we have provided an almost a perfect record for UN peacekeeping operations, because we have just selected with a really cautious training program, and we provide the well-trained staff, peacekeepers and civilian police with professional skills and also, integrity. I think that's very important for such a kind of international enterprise. So that's the first point I would like to mention, and I think it has already won China a lot of applauses in the world. Secondly, as I mentioned, because I personally concentrated a lot on, the social development, economic development in the conflict-affected countries. I think in the whole process of Chinese involvement in the peacekeeping operations, we actually provided substantial and enormous help to those countries. I would like to say probably in an economic way. For example, in the early stage for China to participate in peacekeeping operations, we, as I mentioned before, we built a lot of bridges and roads and hospitals, schools, which just will, I think, benefit a lot for the local people to just enhance their fundamental living standards. And I think it also contributes to their like sustainable development or just eradicate the poverty, probably as the rooting cause of those conflicts.
A role that is going to grow and grow. Thank you so much, Dr. Liu, and everyone on our panel. Well, that's it. That's all we have time for on this edition of The Heat, but we'd love to hear from you. So please send us your questions, comments and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com, and we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook, CCTV America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C., and thanks so much for watching.